With me today is Dan Flores. He holds the A.B. Hammond Chair at the University of Montana, Missoula, where he specializes in environmental and cultural history of the American West. He has written a number of books, and he won the 2009 Western Heritage Award for a magazine article entitled All the Pretty Horses. And it's actually about the horse trade in the early American West from 1775 to 1825. And what prompted you to write about the horse trade?
Well, I have been interested in this sort of early phase of the American West for a long time. I wrote a book 20 or so years ago, 25 years ago, on Thomas Jefferson's attempts to explore the southern Louisiana Purchase in the 2 or 3 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that's when I discovered that there was a kind of a counterpart to the fur trade in the northern West on the southern plains, but it involved wild horses and sort of had there were a lot of analogies that I was able to draw between the wild horse trade in the early West and the fur trade in the northern West.
Mm-hmm. Now, you actually had to start and explain how Indians on the southern plains acquired horses.
I did, yeah. I mean, the horse story is a really fascinating story because, for one thing, it's an animal that is a native North American animal. It evolved here and was here in huge numbers down to around 10,000 years ago, and then unaccountably became extinct in the Americas. And meanwhile, in its early history, it had crossed the Bering Land Bridge and ended up in Asia and Africa and Europe and survived in all those places. So one of the interesting things about horses is that Europeans brought them back to the Americas, and that's one of the reasons why they multiplied to such huge numbers so quickly, is they were basically sort of returning to their homeland, and they were pre-adapted to it. And so within a century and a half after the Spaniards reintroduced them, they were in the millions out on the Great Plains.
And the Indians, being clever and adaptable, took great advantage of that.
They took great advantage of it, and not only sort of reshaped cultures around horses and riding horses and using horses to hunt, but the trade in horses became a really central part of Indian life, especially on the plains, because the horses were mostly found on the southern plains in the early West, and so a trade in horses to take them to the northern plains and the Columbia Plateau, other parts of the West, developed. And that sort of logically fed into a trade that began sending horses eastward across the Mississippi River to the advancing American frontier.
Mm-hmm. Now, what kind of research did you do for this?
Well, I did research that primarily was in original accounts, letters and documents, because there hadn't been anyone who had really preceded me in writing about this trade, this early trade. I mean, there's, of course, there's a sizable literature in the history of horses, but hardly anyone had really known much about this early trade in horses, so I had to assemble the story pretty much from the primary materials, reading Thomas Jefferson's letters, reading the Spanish accounts in the Spanish colonial archives in New Mexico and Texas in particular. And then there were, interestingly enough, a couple of journals kept by these early American horse traders, and those were prized descriptions of what that experience was like.
So most of the trade went north. It went to Anglo, or did they trade a lot with the Indians as well?
Well, the trade that I mostly am describing in this article is the trade that went eastward from the plains to farmers on the advancing American frontier, and to, I mean, the horse in a lot of ways in early America, it's sort of a counterpoint to automobiles in our culture. And so horses of particularly prized qualities, speed, conformation, and so forth, were status symbols for people of upper classes in the early United States. And so these Americans were always on the lookout for horses of high quality. And one of the things these early traders were going for both in trading from the Indians and in trying to catch wild horses themselves, were these really high quality horses that they could take back to places like Kentucky and Tennessee and sell in the horse markets there for up to $150 and $200. So it was a kind of a focus on quality animals, although they did return a lot of mediocre animals that they would sell for anywhere between $25 and $50. But it was the focus that I emphasized in that article is mostly on the trade that went from the west across the Mississippi River to the east.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think most of us today, when we think about wild horses, Mustangs or something, think about a fairly scrawny horse, small in stature and just sort of rough looking. So how did we get these high quality horses someone would pay $200 for?
Well, I think part of it was the result, part of the quality of those horses was the result of the fact that many of these bands had sprung from original Barb and sometimes even Arab stock that had gotten loose from the Spaniards in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So there were some high quality Iberian horses that the Spaniards had brought that were on the plains. There hadn't been a huge amount of admixture with other animals, Northern European animals, for example. It was pretty much in the early 1800s and the late 1700s, which is the time focus of my story. The animals were of fairly pure sort of Spanish Barb and Arab stock, and so they were, some of them at least, were pretty high quality. Now I will say that one of the things these Mustangers do is that they select and choose among the animals they catch. Sometimes they'll catch in the corral drives 1,000 animals and will end up keeping only a couple of hundred of them. So they'll turn the poorer quality animals loose and just keep the better ones. And I think one of the things that happens that causes horses to deteriorate over the 19th century is that it's the poor quality animals that are getting turned back to continue the breeding process.
Right. So,
yeah.
But you mentioned that even after the period that you studied, the horse trade continued. And
it does continue, yeah. I just haven't researched the story. But one of the things that happens in the period after, my story goes up to about 1825, is that the horse trade certainly continues and wild horses spread across other parts of the West. They become a major feature, for example, by the 19th century on the Columbia Plateau, on the Platte River, farther north, even up into Canada. And so this kind of trade in horses and raids for horses remains a feature of the West into the 20th century. In fact, in the early 20th century, many of the animals that provide riding stock for the British Army and the Boer War in South Africa and even in World War I come from places like the Red Desert of Wyoming and the plains of Montana. Miles City, Montana becomes one of the great places for these Allied stock buyers to go and buy American horses. And they mostly come from these wild herds. So it goes on for at least another century.
Mm-hmm. Until we start using trucks.
Exactly. And the horse population, I've forgotten what the actual number is, but it plummets dramatically from about 1920 through about 1960. I mean, the number of animals, of horses in the United States is going to drop by an enormous percentage.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We've had Dan Flores here talking about All the Pretty Horses, which is an article in Montana, the magazine of Western history. You can find it at your library and your bookstore. Mr. Flores is here to pick up a Western Heritage Award for this article. It's the 2009 Wrangler.